What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and we're back with another supplemental video for the Outlaw Rogue Guide series for Shadowlands. More specifically though, we'll be looking at the DPS rotation, as well as some general tips, tricks, and pointers that might prove useful to you. Before we get too wrapped up in that though, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. I usually say that near the end of the videos, and it's something not everybody reaches the whole video because they just start looking for information that they want, and that's perfectly fine. So I just want to say it a little earlier this time, being that we're moving into the new year, so all of my prior viewers and my new ones moving into 2021, I hope that these videos prove helpful to you. Anyways, let's look at what Outlaw Rogue has waiting for us in today's video. So, Outlaw Rogue has the reputation of having a rotation that looks like you're trying to play DDR with your keyboard while each of your socks has been shoved with a fistful of fire ants with no rhyme or reason behind the frantic key presses. However, Outlaw does have a fair number of abilities, especially depending on what talents you're running, and with the addition of our Covenant-specific abilities, it can actually make for a somewhat complex rotation, though you can really consider it an order of priorities more so than a true rotation. Due to Outlaw having numerous things that can affect exactly what ability we'll be using next, it isn't as simple as just following a list of things to do every time. Several of our Roll the Bones buffs will change the rate we gain combo points, which will in turn affect the pacing of our rotation, as well as the Restless Blade's cooldown reduction passive. However, I can give you a pretty good idea of what you should be prioritizing and reasons why. While Outlaw doesn't necessarily have an exact rotation per se, there are a number of things that will affect your exact opening sequence and what you'll do in that opener. Talent choices like Ghostly Strike or Marked for Death will of course work their way into your moveset consistently, while other things are just passive parts of the spec. You'll also have to consider your Covenant choice, your Legendary choice, and the conduits you're running when you look at your opening sequence rotation. As for example, the Echoing Reprimand Kyrian ability gives 3 combo points, whereas Sepsis only gives 1 combo point, and your first Serrated Bone Spike only gives 1 combo point as well, but subsequent ones will give 1 additional one, so yeah, it does change things a little bit with each Covenant. I'll go over what's going to be the most simplistic, single-target opening sequence first, which will involve the following talents, which are showing to be the most commonly used choices in Castle Nathria currently. Despite giving these as a baseline recommendation, I still recommend simming talents like Ghostly Strikes and Marked for Death, as for some characters I've seen some DPS gains by using these ones over the ones I'll be talking about here. And in case you are running those talents, I'll mention where and how they affect the rotation too. Anyways, for this simple loadout of DPS talents, we'll be picking Quick Draw, Deeper Stratagem, Alacrity, and Blade Rush. No surprise to a lot of Outlaw Rogues from BFA, as this is basically the loadout we were using in raiding for virtually all situations back then as well, and these are pretty simple talents to use and get the hang of. So first, I'll let you folks know what the general opener is while explaining why we use the abilities in this order, and then where some tweaks will come in. So you'll start from Stealth naturally, and cast the Roll the Bones ability about 2 seconds before the pull. We'll begin combat with an Ambush and Adrenaline Rush cast simultaneously, then cast Blade Rush, and after that our Covenant-specific ability. From this point, we'll be trying to reach 5 or 6 combo points since we're talented into Deeper Stratagem to spend on our first Slice and Dice cast, and then the next 5 or 6 combo points we earn from Sinister Strike casts and Pistol Shot opportunity procs will be spent on Between the Eyes. After that, we'll basically just keep up with buff management of Roll the Bones, then spend combo points on Between the Eyes to keep the crit debuff on our target and our attack speed buff up from Slice and Dice. All of our remaining combo points will be spent on Dispatch casts. This is a very basic and generic opening sequence that you can use for virtually any Covenant, Legendary, or Conduit loadout, though leaves a lot to be desired and doesn't take advantage of our more ideal loadout options. In virtually all Outlaw Rogue PvE situations, especially raiding, you'll want to be running the Celerity Legendary and the Count the Odds Conduit. Celerity doesn't really change the opening sequence at all, as it just gives us mini procs of Adrenaline Rush whenever Slice and Dice is active, and a flat damage boost while Adrenaline Rush is active. Count the Odds, however, will change things up a bit. I've already done a bit of an exposition video specifically on Count the Odds and ways to maximize the potential of it, so if you want a more in-depth discussion on this potency conduit, then I'll leave a link to it up in the top right of the screen now. Basically though, our opener is going to involve casting our first ambush with Adrenaline Rush still, but within the first few seconds of the opener we'll be vanishing and casting a second ambush. The exact timing of this will change a bit based on your Covenant ability, as for example, if you're a Kyrian, you'll be using Echoing Reprimand almost immediately, which already puts you at 5 combo points, so you'll need to spend those before you can Vanish and Ambush again. The reason we work that Vanish Ambush into the beginning of our opener is because the Count the Odds Conduit gives ambushes and dispatches triple the chance of proccing an extra Roll the Bones buff if they're used from stealth, and it also lasts for 15 seconds instead of 5. And with us literally having everything off cooldown on the pull, and with Bloodlust/Heroism being activated here along with our DPS potion, it is important to try and get as many active Roll the Bones buffs as possible. From here, we'll still want to Blade Rush before spending any combo points, as its cooldown is reduced by both the Restless Blades passive and True Bearing, meaning it will let us get it off cooldown faster so we can use it more regularly. From here is where another split can occur, as you may be able to squeeze your Covenant ability in here if you're still short on combo points, and it won't cause you to overcap. Otherwise, you'll want to hold off on using it and instead spend your combo points on Slice and Dice before using your Covenant move. If you're Venthyr, however, definitely make sure you cast Flagellation before Slice and Dice, since all combo points spent in that Flagellation window will count towards that stacking haste buff you're building up for. You'll then continue generating combo points, spending your next 5 or more on Between the Eyes, and from here on it is the same song and dance as the generic rotation. Talents like Ghostly Strike and Marked for Death can further alter your opening sequence, though not by too much. For example, with Marked for Death, you want to cast it as early as possible before the pull. Generally speaking, most groups want to do a 10-second pull timer instead of just face-pulling the boss. However, the earlier you can cast Marked for Death, the better. A little interesting bit of information for you if you didn't know already. When you cast Marked for Death, you of course gain full combo points. However, if you're out of combat, like before a pull, then an invisible timer is going to be ticking down from those combo points before you start losing them slowly. You'll lose the first one around 17 or 18 seconds, I think. So ideally, if possible, precast Marked for Death between like 10 to 15 seconds before the pull. This is of course kinda hard to time if your group uses 5-second pull timers or 10-second ones, but the closer you can get to that 10 to 15 second range, the better, because that means you'll have less time to wait for it to come off cooldown. Now before the pull, you'll instead cast Roll the Bones at 2 to 3 seconds before pulling, and Slice and Dice around 1 to 2 seconds. That way your first round of combo points spent in combat will go to that Between the Eyes cast, so you'll have all your buffs already active much faster. Ghostly Strike, on the other hand, gets worked into the rotation before spending many, if any, combo points, much like how Blade Rush is. This is because Ghostly Strike is also affected by the Restless Blade's cooldown reduction and True Bearing, meaning combo points spent get it off cooldown faster. Again, Roll the Bones buffs can change your exact way your opener's gonna go, as will your talent choices. However, while the opening sequence is of course important, what is equally important is the priority your moves should be used in once you're in the middle of an encounter. And as I've stressed a couple times already, a lot of our talents and abilities are affected by cooldown recovery from True Bearing and Restless Blades, which is a small part of what gives Outlaw a fast-paced playstyle. Due to this, the priority of each of our moves has, when they're off cooldown, is a big part of maximizing our damage. Naturally, much like in the opener, you'll want your buff and debuff maintenance rolling at all times. This means first and foremost keeping Roll the Bones active constantly, and re-rolling if you're able to and don't have good buffs. Due to Roll the Bones now having a 45-second cooldown, you won't be able to just spam re-roll like you were able to in BFA. However, re-rolling is still something you'll want to keep an eye on, as due to True Bearing and Restless Blades, you'll probably be able to get the cooldown of it down to like every 15 or 20 seconds of being able to re-roll. However, what would you be re-rolling for? What are the good buffs? Well, for singular buffs, you'll want to hold on to True Bearing and Broadside. As cooldown recovery is such a big part of the spec now, True Bearing becomes very important, and Broadside, not only giving us a damage buff, also increases our combo point generation, which increases our cooldown recovery, so both work hand in hand very nicely. Any pair of 2 buffs is perfectly fine, though the weakest pair of the bunch is Grand Melee and Buried Treasure, sadly. A time you might want to get rid of that buff pair early is when your Slice and Dice duration is longer than the boss encounter, which can happen. Since you're effectively defeating the purpose of the buff, it basically doesn't exist, so you have to look at it like you only have 1 buff in that situation. Any other 2 buff or a glorious 5 buff should be kept for the entire duration of them, and the good single buffs like True Bearing and Broadside can be re-rolled a little early. I generally do it with like 3 to 4 seconds left, since that gives the new buffs a little extra duration due to the pandemic refresh effect. Up next, you'll want to make sure you're always keeping the crit chance debuff active on your primary target at all times via the Between the Eyes ability. This received a hefty increase to its cooldown duration compared to prior versions of the ability, so it can now be only used every 45 seconds. However, since it is affected by cooldown reduction, you'll be able to use it much more often than that, probably closer to again every 15 to 20 or so seconds depending on if you roll buffs that give extra combo points or more cooldown reduction. This debuff needs to be kept active as much as possible on whatever target you're focusing, since naturally more crit chance is good crit chance. And as an aside, which I plan on covering more in depth in an AoE and dungeon specific video, you should always be cleaving off whatever target has this debuff applied to it. Next up on the hierarchy of moves is to make sure you keep Slice and Dice rolling constantly. Not only is this a huge damage gain from the increased auto attack speed and the increased energy regen from combat potency procs, but it also is what makes our Celerity Legendary have chance to proc those mini adrenaline rushes. This move is also affected by Pandemic Refresh, so if you're around 11 or so seconds remaining on your Slice and Dice, be sure to refresh it with a full combo point 1 for maximum benefit. For those who don't quite understand what Pandemic Refresh is, basically the game will remember the initial duration of your Slice and Dice buff, and you can basically roll up to 30% of that initial duration into your next cast of Slice and Dice. So for a 36-second move, which is a 5 combo point Slice and Dice, you can Pandemic Refresh about 10.8 seconds, or 11 to make it easier, worth of the cast, allowing your next Slice and Dice to have an additional 11 seconds added to it. Next, for talents and other goodies. Basically, any talent you're using, such as Blade Rush, Ghostly Strike, and Marked for Death, should essentially be used on cooldown, since they're all affected by cooldown recovery buffs. Marked for Death should only be used if you have 0 or 1 combo point though, so don't just hit it just because it's off cooldown and you already have like 3 or 4 combo points or something silly like that. Otherwise, make sure these moves are basically always on cooldown so your other finishers can work towards getting them back off cooldown even faster. If you're running Count the Odds, then Vanish should basically be used on cooldown as well, as you want to get as many casts of it off as possible, and it's affected by cooldown recovery too. There are some exceptions to that rule, such as making sure your Roll the Bones buffs aren't about to fall off, since they reset your Count the Odds buffs when they do fall off. But that topic was in-depth enough that it got its own separate video already, which is the one I mentioned earlier, and I'll link it again just in case you didn't know about it. If all of these are on cooldown, then make sure your Covenant ability is being used immediately. These aren't affected by cooldown reduction from our toolkit, so the time you aren't using it directly reduces the amount of times you'll be able to use it later in the fight. Serrated Bone Spike is a bit of an exception to this since it has multiple charges and they reset when the targets die, so for that you basically just want to make sure you never overcap on charges of Bone Spike. Other than that, your last move to keep using if all of these other conditions have been met is to dump all of your combo points into Dispatch. For your 2 standard combo point generators, you'll basically just use Pistol Shot only when you get an opportunity proc and they won't cause you to overcap on combo points. And other than that, you just spam the old reliable Sinister Strike if nothing else needs to be done. To newcomers of the spec, Outlaw might seem like a frantic mess of button presses just because of how fast our actions permitted are. Literally with celerity and a decent amount of haste, you'll hit well over 60 APM, which is literally higher than the GCD allows for, which is pretty crazy. But once you understand what's going on and what order we do things in and why we do them in that, it starts showing how complex the spec actually is if you really want to get the most out of it, which is pretty interesting, at least to me. And I hope this video is helpful to you. If so, then maybe consider leaving a comment, a like, or even sharing the video with other folks that you know that might find it helpful. It does help immensely with the channel's growth, so I sincerely appreciate any support in those ways. I'd also like to take this time to thank all of my regular viewers, commenters, subscribers, and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.